In the dimly lit halls of medieval castles and the blood-soaked sands of ancient Arabia, the whisper of a blade slicing through the air signaled the end of many a noble life. Beheading, a practice that may seem barbaric to modern sensibilities, was a common form of execution throughout the Middle Ages in Europe and the Middle East. But for the nobility, it was often seen as a more dignified way to meet one's end, compared to the brutal alternatives reserved for commoners. The 14th century French chronicler Jean Froissart once wrote, "The sword is the symbol of knighthood, and to die by the sword is the most honorable death a knight can have." The use of beheading as a form of capital punishment can be traced back to ancient civilizations such as the Greeks, Romans, and Persians. The Persian king Xerxes I, who ruled from 486 to 465, was known to have ordered the beheading of captured enemy soldiers and even the decapitation of the corpse of his fallen foe, King Leonidas of Sparta. In ancient Rome, beheading was known as decollatio and was typically reserved for Roman citizens of high status, such as members of the nobility or military. The Roman historian Livy records the beheading of the consul Spurius Cassius in 485, who was executed for attempting to establish a tyranny. However, it reached new heights of prominence during the medieval period. From the 8th century onward, beheading became increasingly popular across Europe, particularly in England, France, and Germany. Notable figures like Sir William Wallace, a Scottish knight who led a resistance against the English in the late 13th century, and Anne Boleyn, the ill-fated second wife of King Henry VIII, met their ends at the blade of a sword or axe. In a cruel twist of fate, Anne Boleyn's own brother, George Boleyn, was also beheaded just days before her on charges of treason and incest. In the Middle East, beheading was also a common practice, particularly during the time of the Islamic caliphates. The legendary warrior Saladin, who fought against the Crusaders in the 12th century, was known to have ordered the beheading of captured enemy soldiers. In one infamous incident, during the Battle of Hattin in 1187, Saladin reportedly beheaded Reynaud of Chatillon, a Christian knight, with his own hands. The Muslim historian Ibn al-Athir wrote of the event, "Saladin struck him with his own hand and cut off his head, sending it to the caliph in Baghdad as a trophy." But why was beheading considered a more honorable form of execution for the nobility? In medieval Europe, death by beheading was often reserved for those of high social status, while commoners were subjected to hanging, burning at the stake, or even more gruesome methods like being drawn and quartered. Beheading was seen as a quicker and more dignified way to die, as it did not involve the prolonged suffering and public humiliation that other methods entailed. In the words of the 15th century English historian John Stowe, "The death of a beheaded man is speedy, his pain short, and his blood being about the veins, suddenly falleth from the head, whereby he dieth presently." This belief in the swiftness and mercy of beheading was shared by many in the medieval world. Moreover, beheading was often carried out with a sword, a weapon associated with nobility and chivalry. In medieval art and literature, the sword was a symbol of power, honor, and justice. To die by the sword was to die a warrior's death, a fate befitting a noble knight or king. The 12th century French epic, The Song of Roland, tells of the heroic death of the knight Roland, who, mortally wounded in battle, attempts to break his sword Durandal to prevent it from falling into enemy hands. The poem reads, "Many times he strikes it on a dark rock, more than I can tell, the steel grates, but neither breaks nor notches." However, the reality of beheadings was often far from the romanticized image of a clean, swift death. Executioners were not always skilled at their task, and it could take multiple blows to sever a head completely. In 1541, when Margaret Pole, Countess of Salisbury, was beheaded on the orders of King Henry VIII, it reportedly took the executioner 11 strikes to finish the job. The elderly countess, who was 67 years old at the time, was said to have stood still without stirring as the blows rained down upon her neck. Despite the grim realities, beheading remained a common practice throughout the Middle Ages and into the early modern period. It is estimated that between the 13th and 18th centuries, Tens of thousands of people were beheaded in Europe alone. In England, the Tower of London was a notorious site of noble beheadings, with victims including two of King Henry VIII's wives, Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard, as well as the 9-day Queen Lady Jane Grey in 1554. The French Revolution, with its infamous Reign of Terror in the late 18th century, saw the beheading of thousands more by the newly invented guillotine, including King Louis XVI and his wife Marie Antoinette. As the 16th century English poet Sir Walter Raleigh wrote on the eve of his own execution, "Even such is time that takes in trust our youth, our joys, our all we have, and pays us but with earth and dust, who in the dark and silent grave, when we have wandered all our ways, shuts up the story of our days." Heads will roll, the tragic fates of history's beheaded nobles. Beneath the gleaming blades of swords and the shadow of the executioner's axe, the pages of history are stained with the blood of countless nobles whose lives were cut short by the grim spectre of beheading. The 16th century English poet Sir Walter Raleigh, who was himself beheaded in 1618, wrote in his poem, The Pilgrimage, "Tell them of that joy which flies beyond the farthest skies, where life is ever pleasant and sorrow is never present." One of the most infamous cases of noble beheading in English history is that of Anne Boleyn, the second wife of King Henry VIII. Accused of adultery, incest and treason, Anne was imprisoned in the Tower of London in May 1536. Despite her protestations of innocence, she was found guilty by a court of her peers and sentenced to death. On the morning of May 19th, Anne was led to the scaffold erected on the grounds of the Tower. In a final speech, she declared, "I pray God save the King, and send him long to reign over you. For a gentler nor a more merciful prince was there never, and to me he was ever a good, a gentle and sovereign lord." With those words, Anne knelt before the executioner, a skilled French swordsman, and met her fate with a single stroke of the blade. Her final words were, "To Jesus Christ I commend my soul. Lord Jesus, receive my soul." Just a few years later, in 1540, another of Henry VIII's advisers fell victim to the executioner's sword. Sir Thomas More, the former Lord Chancellor of England, was a staunch opponent of the King's break with the Catholic Church. Refusing to acknowledge Henry as the supreme head of the Church of England, More was charged with treason and imprisoned in the Tower. On the day of his execution, July 6th, More mounted the scaffold with a jest, remarking to the onlookers, I pray you, Mr. Lieutenant, see me safe up, and for my coming down, I can shift for myself." As he lay his head upon the block, More declared, "I die the King's good servant, and God's first." More's execution sent shockwaves through Europe, with the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V reportedly declaring, "I would rather have lost the best city of my dominions than such a counsellor." The fate of noble beheadings was not limited to the British Isles. In France, the Reign of Terror during the French Revolution saw the execution of countless nobles by the newly invented guillotine. Among the most famous victims was King Louis XVI, who was beheaded on January 21, 1793, in front of a crowd of thousands in the Place de la Révolution, now the Place de la Concorde. As he mounted the scaffold, Louis attempted to address the crowd, declaring his innocence and forgiveness for those who had condemned him. However, his words were drowned out by the beating of drums, and moments later, his head fell into the waiting basket below. The executioner, Charles-Henri Sanson, later wrote in his memoirs, "The king died as he had lived, with great firmness and piety." Louis's wife, Marie Antoinette, met a similar fate just 9 months later. Reviled by the revolutionaries as a symbol of the excess and corruption of the monarchy, Marie Antoinette was tried and convicted of treason in a sham trial. On the morning of October 16, 1793, she was driven through the streets of Paris in an open cart, subjected to the jeers and insults of the crowd. At the foot of the guillotine, Marie Antoinette accidentally stepped on the executioner's foot. In a final display of the aristocratic manners for which she was known, she turned to him and said, "Pardon me, sir, I meant not to do it." Moments later, her head too fell into the waiting basket. The revolutionary leader Maximilien Robespierre, who had orchestrated the executions of the royal family, met his own end at the guillotine just a few months later. These are just a few of the countless stories of nobles who met their end at the blade of a sword or the drop of a guillotine. From the brave Sir Walter Raleigh, who jested that his beard had committed no treason as he lay his head upon the block, to the tragic Lady Jane Grey, the 9 days queen who was beheaded at the tender age of 16. The annals of history are filled with tales of those who faced death with a mix of courage and despair. In 1536, just a few months after the execution of Anne Boleyn, Henry VIII's illegitimate son, Henry Fitzroy, Duke of Richmond and Somerset, died at the age of 17. Although the official cause of death was reported as consumption, rumours swirled that Henry had ordered Fitzroy's death to eliminate a potential rival to the throne. The poet Sir Thomas Wyatt, who was imprisoned in the Tower at the time, wrote of Fitzroy's death, "These bloody days have broken my heart. My lust, my youth did them depart, and blind desire of estate, who hastes to climb, seeks to revert. Of truth, circa regna tonat, around the throne it thunders." In the end, these stories serve as a reminder of the precarious nature of power and the ultimate price that some were forced to pay for their ambition, their beliefs, or simply their birthright. As Sir Walter Raleigh wrote in his poem The Lie, composed on the eve of his own execution, "Go, soul, the body's guest, upon a thankless errand, fear not to touch the best, the truth shall be thy warrant, go, since I needs must die, and give the world the lie." The executioner's toolkit, instruments of death in the medieval era. In the shadowy realm of medieval executions, the tools of the trade were as varied as they were gruesome. From the glint of a sharpened sword to the thud of a heavy axe, these instruments of death were wielded by skilled executioners whose names have echoed through the ages. The craftsmanship that went into creating these tools was a morbid art form, with each blade and device honed to perfection for the grim task at hand. As the 16th century English poet Robert Southwell wrote, "The executioner's art is to make death a pleasure." One of the most iconic tools of the executioner's trade was the sword. In medieval Europe, the use of the sword for beheadings was often reserved for nobles and those of high rank, as it was considered a more honourable and less painful way to die than other methods. The swords used for executions were typically larger and heavier than those used in battle, with a wider blade designed to sever the head with a single blow. The most famous of these was perhaps the sword of the Tower of London, which was used to behead a number of notable figures, including Anne Boleyn in 1536 and Lady Jane Grey in 1554. The Tower sword, which was made in the early 16th century, had a blade that was over 5 feet long and weighed around 8 pounds. Another famous sword used for executions was the joyeuse, the ceremonial sword of the French kings, which was used to behead the Duke of Montmorency in 1632. Another common tool of the executioner's trade was the axe. In medieval England, the axe was the preferred method of execution for commoners and those convicted of treason. The axe used for beheadings was typically a large, heavy instrument with a broad blade designed to sever the head with a single blow. One of the most notorious axes in history was the Halifax gibbet, a massive guillotine-like device that was used in the town of Halifax, England, from the 16th to the 18th centuries. The gibbet consisted of a large wooden frame with a heavy diagonal blade that was released by a rope. According to local legend, the gibbet claimed the lives of over 100 people during its bloody reign, including that of John of Dalton in 1538, who was executed for stealing a horse. In medieval France, the preferred tool of execution was the maiden, a primitive guillotine-like device that consisted of a large wooden frame with a weighted, angled blade. The maiden was used to execute criminals and political prisoners in Paris and other French cities from the 13th to the 18th centuries. One of the most famous executions carried out with the maiden was that of the French King Louis XVI, who was beheaded in 1793 during the French Revolution. The craftsmen who created these tools of death were often highly skilled artisans who took great pride in their work. In medieval Europe, the art of sword-making was a highly respected trade, with master swordsmiths creating blades of exceptional quality and beauty. One of the most famous swordsmiths of the Middle Ages was a German craftsman named Johannes Lichtenauer, who lived in the 14th century. Lichtenauer was renowned for his skill in creating swords of unparalleled strength and sharpness, and his techniques were widely studied and imitated by other swordsmiths throughout Europe. Another notable craftsman was the French swordsmith Thomas Fivet, who created the famous Joyeuse sword used in the execution of the Duke of Montmorency. The executioners who wielded these tools were often highly skilled professionals who took great pride in their work. In medieval Europe, the position of executioner was often a hereditary one, with the job passing down from father to son over generations. One of the most famous executioners in history was a Frenchman named Charles-Henri Sanson, who served as the royal executioner of France from 1778 to 1795. Sanson, who came from a long line of executioners, was responsible for carrying out some of the most notorious executions of the French Revolution, including those of King Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. Another infamous executioner was the Englishman Jack Ketch, who served as the royal executioner from 1663 to 1686 and was known for his botched executions and drunken behavior. Despite the grim nature of their work, executioners were often respected and even feared figures in medieval society. In some cases, they were even granted special privileges and rewards for their service. In 1476, the English executioner John Hulbert was granted a pardon by King Edward IV for his role in putting down a rebellion led by the Duke of Clarence. Hulbert, who had served as the king's executioner for over 20 years, was given a pension and a house in London as a reward for his loyalty. Similarly, in 1606, the French executioner Jean Guillaume was granted a patent of nobility by King Henry V for his service to the crown. The tools and techniques of the medieval executioner's trade may seem barbaric and cruel by modern standards, but they were a reflection of the harsh realities of life in a time when death was an ever-present spectre. As the French philosopher Michel de Montaigne wrote in the 16th century, death is a release from the impressions of the senses and from desires that make us their puppets, from the vagaries of the mind and the hard service of the flesh. For those who faced the blade of the executioner's sword or the drop of the guillotine, death was a release from the hard service of life in a brutal and unforgiving world. Yet even in the face of such brutality, there were moments of humanity and compassion. In 1541, the English courtier Sir Thomas Wyatt, who had been imprisoned in the Tower of London on charges of treason, wrote a poem entitled Innocentia Veritas, Viat fides circumdederunt me inimici me. My enemies surround me, but innocence, truth, and faith shall prevail, while awaiting his execution. The poem, which was smuggled out of the tower by Wyatt's servant, became a rallying cry for those who opposed the tyranny of King Henry VIII and his bloody reign. From courtroom to chopping block, the grim reality of medieval justice. In the shadows of medieval courtrooms, the fate of countless souls hung in the balance. The legal procedures that led to the ultimate punishment of beheading were a complex and often brutal affair, steeped in tradition and shaped by the harsh realities of the time. From the accused standing trial before a panel of stern-faced judges to the executioner's blade glinting in the sunlight, the path to the chopping block was a grim and unforgiving one. As the 16th century English jurist Sir Edward Coke famously declared, "The life of the law is not logic, but experience." The crimes that were considered punishable by beheading varied from place to place and time to time, but they often included treason, heresy, and other offences against the state or the church. In England, for example, the crime of high treason, which included plotting against the monarch or conspiring with foreign powers, was punishable by beheading from the 13th century onward. In 1388, during the reign of King Richard II, a group of noblemen known as the Lords Appellant were convicted of treason and beheaded for their role in a plot to overthrow the king. Among them was Sir Simon de Burley, a close friend and advisor to the king, whose execution sent shockwaves through the court. Similarly, in 1478, George, Duke of Clarence, the brother of King Edward IV, was convicted of treason and famously drowned in a butt of Malmsey wine as a nod to his notorious love of drink. The legal procedures that led to a beheading were often complex and varied depending on the jurisdiction and the nature of the crime. In many cases, the accused would first be brought before a panel of judges or a jury to face trial. The trial itself could be a lengthy and elaborate affair, with witnesses called to testify and evidence presented by both sides. In some cases, the accused might be subjected to torture in order to extract a confession, a practice that was widely used throughout medieval Europe. The use of torture was sanctioned by the Church and was seen as a legitimate means of obtaining the truth, despite the obvious potential for false confessions. One notorious example of this practice was the trial of the Knights Templar in the early 14th century, during which many of the accused were subjected to brutal torture in order to extract confessions of heresy and other crimes. If the accused was found guilty, the sentence of beheading would be passed down by the presiding judge. In some cases, the condemned might be given a chance to speak before the court, offering a final plea for mercy or a defiant last stand. In 1535, during the trial of Sir Thomas More, the former Lord Chancellor of England, who had refused to acknowledge King Henry VIII as the supreme head of the Church of England, More famously declared, "I am the king's good servant, but God's first." His words would echo through the ages as a testament to the power of conviction in the face of death. Similarly, in 1587, Mary, Queen of Scots, who had been convicted of plotting to assassinate Queen Elizabeth I, faced her executioners with regal defiance, declaring, "In my end is my beginning." Once the sentence had been passed, the condemned would be led to the place of execution, often in a public square or on a hill outside the city walls. The executioner, a skilled professional whose job it was to carry out the sentence, would be waiting with his blade at the ready. In some cases, the condemned might be allowed a final moment with a priest or a loved one before being led to the block. In 1541, Margaret Pole, Countess of Salisbury, was condemned to death for treason at the age of 67. As she was led to the block, she reportedly refused to lay her head down, declaring, "So should traitors do, and I am none." The executioner, unnerved by her defiance, took several blows to sever her head. The role of the executioner was a complex and often misunderstood one. In many ways, the executioner was a reviled figure, a symbol of the brutality and violence of the medieval justice system. Yet at the same time, the executioner was also a skilled professional, a master of his craft, who took pride in his work. In France, the position of executioner was often a hereditary one, passed down from father to son over generations. The most famous of these dynasties was the Sanson family, who served as the royal executioners of France for over 150 years, from the reign of Louis XIV to the French Revolution. Charles-Henri Sanson, who presided over the executions of King Louis XVI and Queen Marie Antoinette, once wrote in his journal, "It is not enough to cut off the head of the condemned. One must do it with skill, with a single blow, without hesitation." Despite the grim nature of their work, executioners were often respected and even feared figures in medieval society. They were seen as the embodiment of the law, the ones who carried out the will of the state and the church. In some cases, executioners were even granted special privileges and protections, such as the right to carry weapons or the immunity from prosecution for crimes committed in the course of their duties. Yet for all the power and respect that executioners commanded, they were also haunted by the weight of their work. In a time when death was an ever-present spectre, the act of taking a life, even in the name of justice, could take a heavy toll on the soul. As the 16th century French executioner Jean Guillaume wrote in his memoirs, "It is a terrible thing to have to kill a man, even when the law demands it. It is a burden that never leaves you, a weight that you carry with you always. This sentiment was echoed by the English poet John Donne, who wrote in his famous work, Meditations Sautitine, "Any man's death diminishes me because I am involved in mankind." Yet even in the face of such brutality, there were moments of humanity and compassion, of individuals who faced death with courage and conviction, and of executioners who struggled with the weight of their terrible duty. One such moment came in 1685, during the execution of the Duke of Monmouth, the illegitimate son of King Charles II, who had led a rebellion against his uncle, King James II. Monmouth, who was known for his charm and bravery, faced his executioner with remarkable composure, even after the first blow of the axe failed to sever his head. As he lay bleeding on the scaffold, he reportedly whispered to the executioner, Jack Ketch, "My friend, you have not done your work. You must finish it." It took Ketch several more blows to complete the job, a grim testament to the brutal reality of the executioner's trade. The executioner's folly, botched beheadings in medieval Europe. In the medieval era, execution by beheading was a common form of capital punishment reserved for nobles and those of high status. While it was considered a more humane and dignified method compared to hanging or burning at the stake, the reality was often far from swift or painless when the task fell into the hands of inexperienced or incompetent swordsmen. The execution of Manfred von Richthofen, a German knight and poet, in 1340 at the hands of an inexperienced executioner, took several blows to complete, leaving the crowd horrified. The famed French philosopher Michel de Montaigne once wrote, "Death, they say, acquits us of all obligations." One of the most infamous botched beheadings in history was that of Mary, Queen of Scots. Mary had been a thorn in the side of her cousin, Elizabeth I of England, for decades. Accused of plotting to assassinate Elizabeth and claim the English throne for herself, Mary was imprisoned for 19 years before being brought to trial in 1586. Found guilty of treason, she was sentenced to death. On the morning of February 8, 1587, Mary was led to the Great Hall of Fotheringhay Castle, where a scaffold draped in black cloth awaited her. In a final act of defiance, Mary wore a crimson dress, the colour of Catholic martyrdom. As she knelt before the block, she declared, "In manus tuas, Domine, commendo spiritum meum. Into thy hands, O Lord, I commend my spirit." The executioner, who was likely drunk, took 3 strikes to sever Mary's head from her body. The first blow missed her neck and struck the back of her head, while the second cut into her neck without fully decapitating her. It was only with the third stroke that the deed was completed. According to witnesses, when the executioner held up Mary's severed head, her wig fell off, revealing that her auburn hair had turned completely grey during her long captivity. Mary's loyal servant, Jane Kennedy, recalled the gruesome scene, saying, "I shall never forget it, nor the Queen's courage throughout, even to the very end." Elizabeth, upon hearing of her cousin's death, reportedly wept and declared, "I'm not free of this case, which was one of the heaviest that ever was laid upon me." Another gruesome example occurred during the execution of Margaret Pole, Countess of Salisbury, on May 27, 1541, at the Tower of London. The 67-year-old countess, who was the last surviving member of the Plantagenet dynasty, was sentenced to death by King Henry VIII for treason. The inexperienced executioner, a wretched and blundering youth, according to contemporary accounts, took 11 blows to hack off Margaret's head. The countess, who refused to lay her head on the block, was chased around the scaffold by the executioner as he struck at her with his axe. Her final words were reportedly, "Blessed be God, though it pleases the king to take my head, he cannot have my heart." The Elizabethan historian John Stowe described the execution as a piteous sight to the people. The execution of Robert Devereux, 2nd Earl of Essex, on February 25, 1601, was another notable case of a botched beheading. Devereux, once a favourite of Queen Elizabeth I, was found guilty of treason after leading a failed rebellion against the Queen. The executioner, who was reportedly inexperienced and nervous, took 3 strokes to sever Devereux's head, causing the crowd to cry out in horror. The Queen, upon hearing of the botched execution, was said to have wept and locked herself in her room for days. Sir Walter Raleigh, who witnessed the execution, later wrote, "I saw the head after it was off, and the very face, as it seemed to me, did express a kind of anger and indignation." It wasn't just the nobility who suffered from poorly executed beheadings. In 1540, during the reign of Henry VIII, a group of 50 prisoners were sentenced to death for treason in London. The executions were carried out by a group of inexperienced and ill-equipped executioners who used blunt swords and axes. The scene was so horrific that it was said to have traumatized even the hardened spectators. One witness described the executions as a very bloody day, and many a poor man lost his head for a word speaking. The Elizabethan playwright Thomas Dekker, in his work The Wonderful Year 1603, wrote of the London executions, "The very same day 53 were executed in divers places of the city, the manner of their death being so terrible, and the spectacle so outrageous." The skill and experience of the executioner played a crucial role in ensuring a swift and clean beheading. In medieval times, the position of executioner was often passed down from father to son, with the knowledge and techniques learned through apprenticeship. However, not all executioners were equally skilled or experienced. Some were hired on short notice, or were themselves criminals who were offered the job in exchange for a pardon. This lack of proper training and expertise often led to prolonged and agonizing deaths for the condemned. In 1476, the city of Nuremberg, Germany, hired a new executioner named Franz Schmidt. Schmidt, who came from a family of executioners, kept a meticulous journal of his work, which spanned 45 years and included 361 executions by sword, rope, and fire. Schmidt's journal provides a rare insight into the life and work of a professional executioner in medieval times. To minimize the risk of botched executions, some cities and towns employed professional executioners who were well compensated for their services. In 16th century France, the executioner of Paris, known as the King's Executioner, was paid an annual salary of 54 livres, a substantial sum for the time. The executioner was also entitled to a portion of the condemned's possessions, including their clothing and any money they carried. In England, the position of executioner was often held by the same family for generations. The Derrick family, for example, served as executioners at the Tower of London for over 200 years, from the 16th to the 18th century. The most famous member of the family, William Derrick, executed over 3,000 people during his career, including Guy Fawkes and the Earl of Essex. One of the most curious aspects of medieval executions was the belief in the healing power of the executioner's touch. In some parts of Europe, it was believed that the touch of an executioner could cure various ailments, from goiters to tumors. People would line up to be touched by the executioner, who would often charge a fee for his services. This belief was so widespread that some executioners became wealthy from their healing touch, despite the gruesome nature of their primary occupation. The theatre of death, beheadings as public spectacle in the medieval world. In the harsh light of day, the crowds gathered, their faces a mixture of fear, fascination, and morbid anticipation. The executioner, hooded and grim, took his place upon the scaffold, his blade glinting in the sun. The condemned, their hands bound and their heads bowed, were led before the jeering multitude, their last moments played out in a grim spectacle of public justice. This was the theatre of death, the ritual of public beheadings that played out across the medieval world, from the streets of London to the squares of Paris. As the famous Prussian general and military theorist Karl von Clausewitz once wrote, "War is not merely a political act, but also a real political instrument, a continuation of political commerce, a carrying out of the same by other means." The public nature of beheadings was a crucial aspect of their power and impact on medieval society. These were not just acts of justice, but carefully choreographed spectacles designed to send a message to the masses. The condemned were not simply executed, but made an example of, their deaths serving as a warning to all who might consider defying the law or challenging the authority of the state. As the philosopher Michel Foucault wrote in his seminal work, Discipline and Punish, the public execution is to be understood not only as a judicial, but also as a political ritual. This was particularly true in cases of treason or rebellion, where the state sought to reassert its power and authority in the most dramatic and public way possible. One such example was the execution of the Scottish knight William Wallace in 1305. Wallace, who had led a rebellion against English rule in Scotland, was captured and brought to London for trial. He was convicted of treason and sentenced to be hanged, drawn, and quartered, a particularly brutal form of execution reserved for the most serious crimes. On the day of his execution, Wallace was dragged through the streets of London on a hurdle, a type of wooden sled, to the place of execution at Smithfield. There he was hanged, but cut down while still alive, and his entrails were then cut out and burned before him. Finally, his body was beheaded and quartered, with his head placed on a spike on London Bridge, and his limbs sent to the four corners of the kingdom as a warning to others. The rituals and ceremonies that accompanied these public executions were elaborate and highly symbolic. In England, the condemned were often paraded through the streets on a horse-drawn cart, their crimes announced to the crowds by a town crier. In France, the condemned were taken to the scaffold in a procession led by a priest, who would offer them a final chance to confess their sins and receive absolution. The executioner, too, had his own rituals to perform, often kneeling before the condemned and asking for their forgiveness before delivering the fatal blow. These rituals were designed to emphasize the solemnity and gravity of the occasion and to remind the condemned of the spiritual consequences of their actions. One of the most famous public beheadings in history was that of King Charles I of England in 1649. Charles, who had been convicted of treason by a special court set up by Parliament, was led to the scaffold outside the banqueting house in London on a cold January morning. A crowd of around 20,000 people had gathered to witness the event, many of them jeering and shouting insults at the deposed king. Charles, however, remained stoic and dignified, delivering a final speech in which he declared his innocence and his belief in the divine right of kings. As he laid his head upon the block, he declared, "I go from a corruptible to an incorruptible crown, where no disturbance can be." The psychological impact of these public spectacles on medieval society was profound. For the condemned, the knowledge that their final moments would be played out before a jeering crowd added an extra layer of terror and humiliation to their ordeal. For the spectators, the experience of witnessing an execution was a powerful and often traumatic one. Many accounts of public beheadings describe the crowds as being alternately fascinated and horrified, with some people fainting or becoming ill at the sight of the severed head. One such account comes from the execution of the French noblewoman Marie-Madeleine Marguerite d'Aubray, Marquise de Brinvilliers, in 1676. The Marquise had been convicted of poisoning her father and two brothers in order to inherit their estates, and her execution was a major public event in Paris. According to contemporary accounts, the crowd that gathered to witness her beheading was so large that it filled the entire Place de Grève, the main square where executions were carried out. As the Marquise was led to the scaffold, the crowd surged forward, eager to get a closer look at the condemned woman. Some people even climbed onto the roofs of nearby buildings to get a better view. When the executioner finally delivered the fatal blow, the crowd reportedly let out a collective gasp, followed by a great cry that echoed throughout the square. Some witnesses described the scene as being like a thunderbolt that struck the crowd, leaving them stunned and silent. Others reported that the sight of the Marquise's severed head, with its wild and frightful expression, was so disturbing that it haunted them for days afterwards. Yet despite the horror and brutality of these public spectacles, they remained a fixture of medieval life for centuries. In some cases, the crowds that gathered to witness an execution numbered in the tens of thousands. In 1571, for example, the French noblewoman Anne was beheaded in Paris before a crowd that was estimated to number around 100,000 people. The event was so popular that the authorities had to erect special viewing stands to accommodate all the spectators. The public nature of beheadings also had a profound impact on the way that justice was perceived and understood in medieval society. For many people, the sight of a condemned criminal being executed in public served as a powerful reminder of the consequences of breaking the law. As the English jurist Sir Edward Coke wrote in the 17th century, "The life of the law is not logic, but experience." The experience of witnessing a public execution was a visceral and unforgettable one, a reminder of the harshness and brutality of the medieval world. The famous execution of Louis XVI during the French Revolution, for example, was a highly symbolic act that marked the end of the monarchy and the beginning of a new era in French history. As the king's severed head was held up to the crowd, the executioner reportedly declared, "Jacques Hébert, this is the head of a traitor." Yet, even as public beheadings served as a tool of social control and a spectacle of state power, they also had a more subversive and rebellious side. In some cases, the condemned used their final moments on the scaffold to deliver defiant speeches or to challenge the authority of their accusers. In 1683, for example, the English political activist Algernon Sidney was beheaded for his alleged involvement in the Rye House plot against King Charles II. As he laid his head upon the block, Sidney declared, "I have always lived in the same principles of liberty and virtue, and now I die for them." These moments of defiance and resistance served as a reminder that even in the face of the most brutal and oppressive forms of state power, the human spirit could still find ways to assert itself. One of the most famous examples of this kind of defiance came during the execution of Sir Walter Raleigh in 1618. Raleigh, an English explorer and courtier who had fallen out of favour with King James I, was sentenced to death for allegedly conspiring against the king. On the day of his execution, Raleigh mounted the scaffold and delivered a powerful speech in which he maintained his innocence and criticised the king's policies. "I am now at the brink of eternity," he declared, "and ready to plunge into the abyss, and I hope that my faith and charity to God will carry me up into the clouds." Raleigh then laid his head upon the block and, according to legend, asked the executioner to show him the axe. "This is a sharp medicine," he reportedly said, "but it is a physician for all diseases." With those words, he signalled to the executioner to strike the fatal blow, meeting his death with a courage and dignity that would be remembered for centuries to come. The fading blade, the rise and fall of beheading in Western society. In the shadows of history, the executioner's blade loomed large, casting a grim spectre over the lives of those who dared to defy the law. From the blood-soaked scaffolds of medieval Europe to the grim final act of the guillotine's reign during the French Revolution, beheading held a unique and macabre place in the annals of Western civilization. This sentiment echoes the words of the infamous French executioner Charles-Henri Sanson, who presided over the beheadings of King Louis XVI and Queen Marie Antoinette during the Revolution. "The blade is always ready, and the hand never trembles." As the centuries passed, however, attitudes towards beheading began to shift. The Age of Enlightenment in the 18th century brought with it new ideas about justice, human rights, and the role of the state in administering punishment. Philosophers such as Cesare Beccaria and Jeremy Bentham argued for the abolition of torture and cruel punishments, including beheading, in favor of more humane and rationalized systems of justice. In his influential treatise, On Crimes and Punishments, 1764, Beccaria wrote, "The punishment of death is pernicious to society, from the example of barbarity it affords. At the same time, advancements in technology were beginning to change the nature of executions. The invention of the guillotine during the French Revolution was seen as a more egalitarian and efficient method of beheading, as it could be used to execute people of all classes with a single swift blow." As the French journalist Camille Desmoulins wrote in 1789, "The guillotine is the law made efficient, the law made visible, the law made inevitable." The guillotine quickly became a symbol of the revolution and was used to execute thousands of people. In a grim twist of fate, Desmoulins himself would later be executed by guillotine during the Reign of Terror in 1794. Despite these changes, however, beheading remained a common method of execution in many parts of Europe well into the 19th century. In England, for example, the last public beheading took place in 1820, with the execution of 5 Cato Street conspirators who had plotted to assassinate members of the British cabinet. The event drew a crowd of around 100,000 spectators, many of whom had travelled from far and wide to witness the grim spectacle. One eyewitness account described the scene as a sea of human faces, all turned towards the scaffold, all eager to catch a glimpse of the last moments of the condemned. As the 19th century progressed, however, public attitudes towards capital punishment began to shift once again. The rise of the prison system and the development of new forms of punishment, such as hard labor and solitary confinement, began to replace older methods of execution, such as beheading. At the same time, the increasing influence of liberal and humanitarian ideals led to growing calls for the abolition of the death penalty altogether. One of the most significant turning points in the history of beheading came with the publication of Victor Hugo's novel The Last Day of a Condemned Man in 1829. The book, which tells the story of a man sentenced to death by guillotine, was a powerful indictment of the cruelty and inhumanity of capital punishment. As Hugo wrote, "It is not the knife that is unjust, it is the hand that wields it." The novel had a profound impact on public opinion and helped to galvanize support for the abolition movement. In 1848, Hugo delivered a famous speech before the French Constituent Assembly in which he declared, "What we need is not the death penalty, but education, light, not blood." Hugo's book helped to galvanize public opinion against the death penalty, and by the mid-19th century, many European countries had begun to restrict or abolish the practice of beheading. In 1870, for example, the Netherlands became the first country in the world to formally abolish capital punishment, followed by Portugal in 1867 and Italy in 1889. In Britain, the last public execution by beheading took place in 1868, with the hanging of Michael Barrett outside Newgate Prison in London. The event was attended by a crowd of around 2,000 people, many of whom expressed disgust and revulsion at the spectacle. As one eyewitness later wrote, "The sight was so sickening that I turned away my head." Despite these trends, however, beheading remained a legal form of execution in some parts of Europe well into the 20th century. In Germany, for example, the guillotine was used to execute criminals as late as the 1940s, with the last recorded execution by guillotine taking place in 1949. The last public beheading in Europe took place in 1977 in France, when Hamida Jandoubi was executed by guillotine for the torture and murder of his girlfriend. The execution, which was witnessed by a small group of officials and journalists, marked the end of a centuries-old practice that had claimed countless lives. The French president at the time, Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, later reflected on the execution, saying, "The death penalty is not a matter of efficiency, it is a matter of conscience." The abolition of the death penalty in France in 1981 marked a significant shift in attitudes towards capital punishment, not just in France, but across much of Europe. Today, beheading is no longer used as a form of legal punishment in any Western country, although it remains a practice in some parts of the world, particularly in the Middle East and North Africa. The legacy of beheading, however, continues to cast a long shadow over the history of Western civilization, serving as a reminder of the darker chapters in our collective past. As the American writer Mark Twain once observed, "History doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes." And so, as we bid farewell to this exploration of the medieval world's most macabre form of punishment, let us take a moment to reflect on the enduring resilience of the human spirit, even in the face of unimaginable cruelty and injustice. For in the end, it is not the blade that defines us, but the strength and compassion we show in the face of adversity. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the dark heart of history. Until next time.